This is 4 p.m. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jisun Jung, and I'm the Consortium for Higher Education Research in Asia member of the University of Hong Kong. We have very excellent two speakers today, Dr. Kelsey and then Dr. Yangson Kim. Then they will present the research about experiences of the PhD in Japan, domestic and international students' perspectives. Let me briefly introduce two speakers of today. Dr. Kelsey is a research associate at the Department of Education, University of Oxford. The research area includes doctoral education, academic writing, and publishing, and researchers' careers. And our second speaker today, Dr. Yangson Kim. She's an associate professor at the Research Institute for Higher Education at Hiroshima University in Japan. Research areas about academic profession, internationalization of higher education, research productivity and collaboration of academics, and also governance of higher education. So two speakers, we talk about PhD students' experience in Japan, which we have very limited knowledge. So it's very exciting topic. Now I hope everybody is engaged in the dialogue, and two speakers will have 40 minutes, 35 to 40 minutes. Is that okay? And then we can have like 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Kelsey Inouye first, please.
Great, thank you so much. I will begin by sharing my screen. Okay, and then. Okay. Right. Well, thank you first for the invitation to speak today. We're really excited to share some of the initial findings of our project on the experiences of the PhD in Japan. I'm going to start off by sharing the first part of the presentation, and then I will hand off to my colleague, Yangson. So the outline of the presentation, we'll begin by talking a bit about the context, why the interest in Japanese PhD education, followed by a bit of the history of the PhD in Japan and kind of what the current structures look like now. We'll then highlight the research questions, the methods and participants, and then talk about some of the key emerging findings from this study, as well as implications, conclusions, and future research. So to begin, I'll start by describing the context in which the study takes place. So discourses around the decline of Japanese research productivity. Oh, sorry, something is.
They welcome hundreds of workers from overseas.
Let me, 1 second. Sorry about that. There seems to be like an online thing that comes on in this room. Anyway. Okay. So there are discourses around the decline of Japanese research productivity, and these will likely be familiar to many of you, as it's certainly a topic that appears in news outlets quite regularly, especially over the past few years. Alongside initiatives like the Top Global Universities program that aims to support Japanese universities, which lead the sector in internationalization and research. So this problem around the decline of Japanese research productivity is something that is repeatedly highlighted in news outlets. At the same time, enrollment in PhD programs in Japan has also steadily decreased since it peaked in 2005. Because PhD education is closely linked to research production, because PhD students contribute to their universities and shape the future of academia, we are quite interested in examining the Japanese PhD to understand, how students experience their doctoral programs in Japan, and whether we can learn anything that provides insight into why PhD enrollment has been decreasing. So before I turn to sort of the specific research questions of this study, the next two slides are going to focus a bit on kind of the context of the PhD in Japan. So a bit of historical background. The PhD in Japan is a hybrid of German and North American models of the doctorate. So during the Meiji Restoration, Japan began importing models of higher education systems from Western countries. So prior to World War II, they primarily used the German model as being the key influential model of PhD education in Japan. And so the German model, of course, is where the PhD focused on conducting research under a single supervisor without any sort of coursework or really structured program of work. However, following World War II, the US North American model of the PhD was imported to try to reform some of the graduate education in Japan in an effort to modernize the system. And so that's where you have the more structured coursework model of the PhD that is quite prevalent in the US and Canada. However, the extent to which this more structured US model of the PhD was adopted in Japan was quite varied. So for instance, it was less adopted in sort of the humanities and social sciences programs when compared with a lot of in the STEM disciplines that tended to draw more on the structured program. So today, PhD education takes place primarily at sort of imperial national universities in Japan, as well as some of the private universities. And because of the historical context that I just described, there are kind of two key sort of types of PhD that currently exist in Japan, the Keitai and the Ronbun. So the Keitai doctorate is based on the North American model, and this includes the required courses, the PhD dissertation, as well as that oral defense or examination of the PhD thesis. Whereas the Ronbun doctorate aligns with the German model, in which the PhD is earned by just submitting the dissertation without coursework. And that tends to be primarily common in the humanities and social sciences versus in the STEM fields. And basically, this is because before the 1990s, there were more clear requirements and expected qualifications for PhDs and professors in natural sciences and engineering, whereas formal requirements for the doctorate and for professorships in the social sciences and humanities were more variable and less clear. So the PhD in Japan today. So today, as in many other parts of the world, there are fewer academic job opportunities for PhD holders. The competition for permanent positions is extremely high. And further complicating this picture of employment is the traditional preference in the Japanese industry for people who have bachelor's degrees, who are viewed as being kind of easier to train and easier to integrate within a company versus someone who's maybe coming with a PhD who has a very specialized knowledge set prior to entering a Japanese company. So currently, the largest number of PhD students in Japan are enrolled in medical and health sciences, followed by engineering. And this reflects both kind of greater funding for research in these disciplines, but also the importance placed on employability following the doctoral programs and kind of the rate of return on your degree. Whereas I suppose in like humanities and social sciences, the employment and rate of return is a bit less uncertain. There's also an increasing number of shakaijin, who are students who are doing part-time PhDs. So often these are people who are working full-time and doing the doctorate on the side, and this really limits their ability to attend face-to-face courses and sort of meet with supervisors on a face-to-face basis. So that kind of leads us to our research questions. So our overall question was, how do domestic and international students experience the PhD in Japan? And sub-questions included, why do these students choose to do a PhD in Japan? What are their career aspirations? And what, if any, differences exist between their experiences of the PhD in Japan? So to investigate these questions, we used a qualitative interview-based approach. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 international students and 15 domestic Japanese PhD students. Most were currently enrolled in a PhD program, but we did have a couple who had just graduated at the time of interview. They were recruited first through our networks and then through snowball sampling, and interviews were held either in Japanese or English, depending on the participant's preference. Because we are both not, fluent in Japanese at this point, we did have an interpreter present at any interviews that took place in Japanese to kind of help with the flow of the interview. All the interviews were transcribed and translated into English for analysis, and we used a combination of sort of deductive coding based on our research questions and the existing literature, but then supplemented with inductive coding for additional themes. So this is kind of just a chart of some of our participants, so you can get a sense of the breakdown of who we spoke with. So these are our domestic participants. As you can see, we have a lot from social sciences in particular. That's by far the most popular discipline that we're able to get. And many of them were sort of in their first, second, or third year of the program, though we did have a couple who were further out. And this is our international students. So again, these international students they're all in their second or third year of the PhD, mostly from social science, and they're all sort of in their 20s or 30s. And so now I will pass to my colleague to talk about some of the findings.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. So from now on, I want to share the findings. So through the findings, we want to share kind of 3 key differences between domestic and international students based on the, motivation, career aspiration, and experiences. Can you move the next one? Okay, related to the motivation, these quotes from the domestic students, as you can see through these quotes, most of participants from both domestic and international groups chose to do the PhD to advance their academic career as a kind of certificate or requirement to enter the academia. However, most of domestic students, they mentioned that they decide to study in Japan due to the language limitation as well as work and family reasons. As Kelsey explained that like there are many shakaijin who is full-time worker and during their PhDs, and also their ages are very diverse. So it is quite related to their family commitment and work commitment as well as language limitation. And also they mentioned about the course, actually Japanese doctoral education, there are 2 different types, but Kate doctorate also, they provide very limited coursework. So students mentioned that their kind of PhD programs are designed for, well designed for the part-time students like shakaijin. Can you move to the next one? Yeah. On the other hand, like international students relate to their motivation to come to Japan for their PhD is quite related to the geographical reasons. That means that there are quite many international students from China or Southeast Asia. So the Japan is quite near from their home country. So geographical reason is quite clear. And second one is related to the kind of networks between the Japanese faculty member, not only between the students and Japanese faculty, but also their supervisor in their home country and faculty members in Japanese university. So they have already kind of kind of connection or networks with the Japanese faculty members. The last one is international student mentioned that they have a quite, they can easily get quite generous scholarship in Japan, not only from the government, but also from the universities. Can you move to the next one? Related to the career aspiration and relocation, here is the quotes from a Japanese student. As you can see, there are quite, they mentioned that related to the career aspiration, they want to stay in Japan. In the line with the decision or motivation to do the PhD in Japan, they worry about their language barriers, especially related to English. So they want to stay in Japan after their graduation. And also, even though there are some kind of opportunities to go abroad, they want to kind of have a short term rather than long term. So they want to stay more in Japan than kind of internationally move to the other place. That is quite related to the motivation, which is related to language barrier. So that's quite connected with the motivation and also career aspiration. Can you move to the next one? On the other hand, international PhD students in Japanese university, they are quite open-minded to the future career. So they consider basically English-speaking countries for their destination after the graduation. And also there are another option that their home countries, so like China or East Asian countries, they can consider as a kind of alternatives destination after the graduation. Can you move to the next one? The last point is related to their experiences. There are both domestic and international students share some kind of similarities related to the kind of little coursework during the PhD and very solitary during the PhD program. And they have a fairly good relationship with the supervisor and kind of generous support from supervisor. However, the most differences between the international and domestic students, according to their experiences, is quite related to the financial support from government and university. So here is mainly mentioned, these quotes are mentioned by domestic student. So we had 15 domestic students, most of them, like all of them mentioned about the financial support. So they have very limited financial support, and they are very kind of anxious related to the financial support. Also, there are two different kind of scholarship in Japanese university, but mostly those kind of scholarship is loan rather than kind of grant. So that means that they should pay back after the graduation. So the reason it relates to the financial support is Kelsey mentioned that, like a Shakaizen is that they are working as a full-time. In that case, scholarship is very limited for the part-time student, what I mean the full-time worker. So they have a very limited opportunity to apply and get the scholarship in Japanese university. Also, there are very specific kind of traditional system of household. So female academics, if she has a husband who is working, then she cannot apply for the kind of scholarship because the system of household. So that's another kind of issue that female students have the difficulties to get the scholarship in Japan. Can you move to the next one? However, international students, they have quite easy to get the scholarship from government side and also university, because mostly international students are full-time and they are quite young, so they are focused more on their PhD programs. So there are more opportunities to apply and get the scholarship. So not only from the next Ministry of Education, this kind of Ministry of Education, and also there is another JASO kind of a government side organization. Also university provide the international students for kind of attending international conference or some kind of thing. So international students tend to get generous kind of scholarship during the PhD. Can you move to the next one? So here's the summary and discussion. So as you can see, domestic Japanese students and international students have a different kind of motivation to study in Japan. So domestic students are mostly, they prefer to stay in Japan related to the language barriers, but international students, they are open to their career, future career, not only in Japan, but also all other countries like English-speaking countries or home countries. Related to this kind of and also experience related support thing, we have two critical discussion point that Japanese PhD program is very domestic oriented. That means that students, they prefer to study in Japan, and also they prefer to stay in Japan after the graduation. That means that their training is very domestic oriented. So during the kind of PhD program, they need to think about how they increase their competency related to the international competitiveness and so on. So that is a very critical, but although they mentioned that there is a kate doctoral students, but the coursework and curriculums are quite limited. That means that the Japanese university needs some kind of well-organized curriculum for kate doctoral students are necessary. Second point is related to the students' PhD experiences. Of course, many doctoral domestic students are part-time students and they are working. So they have very limited opportunity to apply the scholarship. But many previous study mentioned that their scholarship is very important factor to shaping their kind of overall PhD experiences. So financial issue is quite critical for domestic students rather than international students in Japanese university. Can you move to the next one? Yeah, of course, this study is we share just preliminary findings, and also there are some limitations. So we tried to interview some kind of diverse students, but still it is quite limited number of participants from both domestic and international backgrounds. So we'd better consider more participants from the diverse background, but our interviewees are mostly from the social science backgrounds. And also Kelsey and we can understand a little bit about Japanese, but we are not native Japanese speaker. So sometimes we can overlook the certain nuance in the Japanese interviews. And the last point is related to the kind of limited link to overall national level agendas related to internationalization and research production. As Kelsey explained the background about the Japanese university. So very domestic oriented doctoral training and very limited opportunity to increase their international competencies and experiences during the doctoral education. And also there are limited or lack of financial support for the domestic Japanese students. Can you move the last one? So the last slide is related to future research. So we well understand the limitation of this study. And so we suggest the future research, like considering diverse background of the PhD students in Japan, and also not only from the perspective from the PhD student, but also like a diverse perspective, not like outside of university, like corporates and also media and very general, ordinary Japanese people and so on. And second point is we had focused more on social science area because we use the snowballing techniques, but we need to investigate difference between a different type of university, not only for the national but also like a public and private university, and between the humanities social science and STEM field and so on. Last point, also need to connect the national level policies and academic profession development. So when we thought about this kind of PhD program, a PhD program itself not independent. What I mean that it's very dependent with the professional development in Japanese academia. So we need to consider how we can connect this kind of PhD program and after their academic development of academic profession. That's all connected. So we need further studies. So next one is references, and that's all for today. So if you have any comments and questions, please feel free to share.
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey and Yangson, for your presentation and sharing these findings. We have actually a lot of questions in the chat, so I will invite some of the participants to ask questions. So I put very simple question about the mission, but Lily, our colleague, she elaborated questions much more detailed way. Lily, are you there? Yes. Thank you, Lily. Dr. Lily Jung is one of our colleagues in the faculty. Please.
Yes, my question is, I think there are different kind of admission criteria from different universities, and I wonder what's the admission criteria in the universities in Japan, and does it differ in terms of the types of university, like top universities or maybe regional universities or universities in one particular city? So in terms of requirements, do you actually look into detail in terms of where they graduate for their first degree, or whether or not they have research experiences previously, or like initial publication, something like that? And what is the typical profile of a PhD recruited to have a degree or be considered for a scholarship?
Mm-hmm. Kelsey, do you want to start, or I can answer?
Go ahead. You can start.
Yeah, go ahead, Yangson. Yes.
Okay. So actually, the admission criteria is very diverse based on their program and university. So it is not easy to mention that which is the main kind of typical admission criteria for PhD students in Japanese university. But of course, Japan has a quite unique system because there is some kind of period as a research student before they enter master or PhD program. That means that they have one semester or 1 year. They have some kind of supervision, under supervision by supervisor. They contact supervisor first, and then they have some time to negotiate, not negotiate, but anyway, they have some discussion during the 1 semester and 1 year. So usually, because the PhD program don't have a kind of coursework, so many faculty members ask the student to start the master, or they have a same university or same chair, they start a master. So they have this kind of graduation from the master degree, of course, but they don't care much about the publication. Of course, they can submit if they have, but usually for the admission criteria for the PhD student, we do not ask the kind of publication. And second point is mostly, especially social science, humanity, they ask kind of specific level of Japanese language. Of course, the STEM field is a bit different, but they have to submit kind of transcription, of course, and master degree certificate, and also relate to the Japanese language proficiency. So that's the main kind of criteria for the PhD, because they already have some kind of 1 semester, 1 year with the supervisor. So during this period, faculty members can evaluate students if she or he is qualified for the PhD program in the university. So I think it's a bit different from Hong Kong or Korea or other place, but Japan has that kind of process for the admission or PhD.
see. So the degree, the first degree, which university they have obtained their first degree, is usually not a criteria, one of the criteria.
Actually not, but usually because the PhD programs are mainly conducted in the research-oriented university, that means the top-level national university and some Waseda and Keio top-level private university. Of course, there are some kind of inbreeding thing, like if they graduate the same university, it's much easier to enter master and PhD. But anyway, during the research student period, faculty members can evaluate these students, so they can enter the PhD program. So of course, yes, that is true related to the first degree, but master degree is much more important than first degree. So because during the master degree, student usually take the courses, then PhD program, they have to write their dissertation. So that's the process to move from first master and PhD.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
it's very interesting to hear about research student period because it's very unusual practice in many places. But how is it for international students? Do they also do this student assistant period? Because it sounds very impossible to come to Japan only to do the assistant before the PhD program.
Okay. Kelsey, do you want to answer or? Okay, so because I was trained in Korea, so when I came to Japan, research student period is very, how can I say, it was not used to do for me because I have never experienced that kind of period. But actually research student kind of system or some kind of period is mainly for the international student because they didn't have any experience in the Japanese university. So faculty members provide some advisor during this period. Then international students have to be used this kind of system. So actually this research student period is more for the international student rather than domestic student. Because domestic students mostly they graduate from the same university from undergraduate and they move to the master and then they move to the PhD. So it is easy to manage their environment. But for the international student, they are not used to this kind of Japanese academia or Japanese university. So this kind of period more focusing on kind of international students. So of course, domestic students also do this kind of research student period. But anyway, that is the way to move from undergraduate to PhD. So.
Are they paid for those 6 months or 1 year?
Yes,
Oh.
they have to pay. And also there is some very strict kind of screening system, screening process. So international students should apply 1 semester before, and they should contact a supervisor first. And there's a university level screening system. And then faculty, during the faculty kind of meeting, then they decide this student will be accepted or not. So finally, they can get the visa for the six months or 1 year. Then they can keep their status as a research student. Then they can have opportunity to have an entrance exam after this period.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. Well, thank you, Yangson. Can I invite Yifeng home? Yifeng?
Yes.
Yes,
Can you
hi.
hear me? Okay, hey.
Yes.
Just one quick comment following your question. I know that the Ministry of Education in Japan, they actually provide scholarship to research students. So actually, some international students, they can get the scholarship to attend the research student programs before they fully or officially enroll in doctoral programs. Okay, so one question I have is in your research, in your study, do you have participants from both EMI and JMI programs? And if so, do you see a difference between the students in different programs? Because my assumption is that students coming from different tracks may have already, have different dispositions and skills, for example, Japanese proficiency skills per se. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Feng.
I guess I
Okay.
can take this one. So there was a combination of EMI and JMI students in our participant pool, but it was mostly, I think, divided along the international versus domestic student lines. So many of our international students, quite a few were in EMI programs, although many of them also could speak Japanese. And I think most of our Japanese national students were in Japanese medium instruction student programs. Although I think there might have been like one or two who were doing EMI. But in terms of like differences in motivations, aspirations, and experiences, I don't think we actually saw a huge difference in their responses. Everyone, in terms of motivation across the board, it was highly related to career, aspirations, getting sort of professorships and academic posts, motivations around, just being able to do research in particular areas. And in terms of experience, again, there seemed to be quite a lot of continuity across all the programs, regardless of EMI, JMI, or international and domestic, in the sense that, concerns about, lack of that structured coursework, which, came up quite a bit, and that sense of solitude and, having to kind of figure things out for yourself. That experience seemed to resonate across all of our participants. So I don't think there was a very significant difference, but perhaps Yangson has comments as well.
Okay, so most of interviewees which we have conducted is basically more in the JMI, but it is hard to say JMI course or program because usually EMI is not based on the course. It's more like a subjects or some kind of based on classes. So there are only few students are EMI, but basically, as I mentioned, PhD programs, there are not that many coursework and more related to the supervision by supervisor. So if a faculty member can speak English, then of course this faculty can accept the PhD only using the English. But there are still quite a limited number of classes and courses in EMI program in Japanese university. So mostly from the they are studying in Japanese, and basically a majority of international students are from China and some kind of Chinese background countries. So they can understand a bit the Chinese character at least. So even in they are in EMI, but yeah, we cannot find quite clear differences based on these kind of EMI or JMI, but we are more focusing on related to the international or domestic students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Feng. Mintain, are you there? I think that it's also related to the question about language. Mintain, you can speak.
Yes.
Hi.
Thank you, Jisun.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, it's probably cover about that because I heard about when I do some of the research about the Japanese universities, they also need some of the Japanese language requirement kind of that, and that makes some of the international student, for example, like from South Asian students, to hesitate applying there because they have like zero knowledge of Japanese, and then they get difficulty to get entering the country like that because without knowing any Japanese as well, there would be some problem in terms of the cultures and things like that. So my question is like, normally do university need a kind of Japanese language requirements, for PhD? Yeah.
Yes, language requirements varies by program and also university. But in my university and in my program, actually, they do not require the kind of Japanese proficiency, but anyway, students should submit the Japanese test score, even the test score is very low, but anyway, they should submit. So it is some kind of programs they do not allow to enter without the Japanese test score. So that is a very critical issue. But many of faculty members in Japanese university, they prefer to use the Japanese rather than English. So sometimes this kind of language barriers or language issues are very critical in Japanese universities. Yeah, that's what I can answer. So, yeah.
All right, can we move on, Kelsey, or do you have some comment to add for that language issue? No, not this point. All right. I will move on to the next question from Dr. Ugorta. I don't think he can speak, so I will read for him. And there are two key questions, main questions from him. One is about main challenges that international PhD students have in Japan. What kind of learning experience, what are the challenges, and whether those experiences affect their job preference after PhD. That's the first question. The second question is about differences between universities, like one student in big Tokyo University, research intensive, top university, or like a smaller university in a local regional university. If you have a comment for that two questions, please.
Okay, maybe I can start with that first question about challenges faced by international PhDs. So one of the things that sort of came up in some of the interviews that international PhDs commented on was kind of the sometimes the content of the coursework that they took in Japanese PhD programs. So there were a couple of participants who thought that perhaps the material being covered was a bit basic in comparison to, what they did in master's degrees in their other countries. And so I think to some extent, for some international PhD students, the coursework and the material being presented didn't quite match up with their expectations of what they thought they would get in a PhD program. I think in terms of the sort of social experience, it sort of depended, it varied quite a bit, I think, between international students, depending on sort of the university that they were at. For instance, some participants who were at universities that had more international students, they said that they felt that they did have those networks. They were able to kind of meet other people who weren't necessarily Japanese. And so they felt like, even though it was a new place for them, there were other people that they could speak to. But that again, that quite varied from university to university, depending on the environment, I suppose. In terms of how experiences affect future job preferences. So I think, again, overall, everyone was quite adamant that they wanted to pursue some kind of academic or research related career. I suppose the main difference for international PhD students, as was pointed out earlier by Yangson, is that international students tended to be more open to moving to different places following the PhD. And so they could say, well, some of them said, I really like it in Japan. I like the culture here. It's comfortable. So I'm looking for, a career potentially to stay here a bit longer in academia. But others were quite, open to the possibility of looking elsewhere to other countries, maybe going back to China if that's where they were from, for instance. And so in general, their horizons were a bit more sort of mobile in that sense. But I don't know that there was, I suppose the main connection between their experience in the PhD and job preferences were sort of whether they felt comfortable in Japan and in this particular environment.
Okay, so additionally, I think language barrier is quite important for their kind of experience during the PhD. So international students sometimes, of course, there are some international students can speak and fully understand the Japanese, but on the other hand, many PhD international students, if they cannot speak any Japanese, then they have kind of experience that they cannot survive in this academic society. That's why they move to the English-speaking countries or home countries. So I think the language barrier is quite critical. So if they can speak and understand Japanese, then they, of course, they want to stay in Japan. But even though they are very open-minded to go abroad, but still they also consider to stay in Japan. So it's very depend on their language ability. So that kind of thing is quite important. And another thing is related to the many international students, they love Japanese culture and Japanese kind of thing. But the problem is many domestic students are shakaijin, we explained that. So they expected to have some connection and networks with Japanese students and Japanese academics. But it is very difficult to make a connection or networks with Japanese people during the PhD. So that's another point I want to mention. And related to the second one, which we suggest the further study. So we want to analyze how these PhD students have a different experience by the type of university, like a national, imperial national. And also there are some layers like imperial national university and top private university. And also there is a public, which means a local government funded some university for the PhD program. But we could not find some kind of differences during from this study, but I think we can analyze this one later. But related to the, of course, it is related to the university, but also related to the location. For example, like a Todai, Kyodai, University of Tokyo and University of Kyoto, they are in the city. So students are more satisfied with their experience. But like my university, like in the countryside, and the campus is very local area, then they have a different experience during the PhD. So I think, of course, not only for the academic experience, but also like social experience are quite different by the type of university. It is okay, Ugo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good, thank you. We have a question from Wahid, but I don't see him anymore. I think he had to leave a bit early. Wahid, all right, so, but I think he raised an interesting question, so I'll ask you, how experiences and motivations are different between disciplines? Like if you have ever found like disciplinary differences, would you like to share?
I think some of the key differences linked to discipline sort of had to do with how they perceive the value of their PhD, particularly beyond academia. So there was a lot of concern in the interviews around kind of, you know, what their PhD means kind of beyond the academic sector, because of course, although they want to work in academia, you know, we all know that it's quite difficult to find a permanent job. And I think this is something that, you know, resonates across many different country contexts. But those who are in humanities and social sciences were particularly concerned that, you know, those particular disciplines are not really valued as much in Japanese society beyond the academia. Since a lot of the emphasis is placed in kind of industry and STEM fields and that sort of innovation, they were quite concerned about what they would be able to do with that PhD, you know, in the wider sector. And I think that was kind of a key sort of fear that, humanities and social sciences PhD students had, that the STEM field didn't experience as much, although some of the STEM PhD students did say that still, even with their degrees, a PhD is not necessarily something that Japanese companies are looking for, and they might actually prefer someone with a master's degree, even in STEM fields, which was rather interesting. But yeah, I think that was one of the key differences in terms of discipline.
Yangson, you want to add something, or you
No,
want to
I
move on?
think
Good.
yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, good. Because I think the next question from So Young is also very related to that question, because I think So Young also had to leave a bit early, but she asked about like this social perspective, like public perspective about these PhD students. I can read it out. If they are also discussed the differences between domestic and international students in Japan, like public perspective about them. That's her first question. And then second question, in relation to that, how do you link this research about individual experiences to the wider contributions, wider discussion beyond understanding student experience as individuals?
In terms of our first question around sort of public perspective of international versus domestic, so that's something that we weren't able to really look at in this particular study, but it is something that we think would be really interesting. So we did discuss, interviewing, for instance, employers, to see like what their perspectives are of not only just the PhD, but we could look at this domestic and international dynamic as well. So I think that's a really interesting question for future research. In terms of her second question, so I think one of the things we were looking at in a paper that we're working on is kind of the relationship between sort of structural factors within Japanese society on sort of a macro level in terms of like the economy and that sort of thing and culture, but also institutional and then like individual program level to try to understand how these different structures interact with and shape individual experiences and vice versa. And I think, that sort of work could have implications to understand, like what's happening in universities and what recommendations could we make in terms of, providing different kinds of support that could be, have wider implications potentially. But maybe Yangson wants to add something.
No, I think Kelsey explained quite well, so I think it's enough. But just add like mainly domestic student mentioned about the financial support for during their PhD program. So I think this is a quite relate to their kind of experiences. Of course, not only for the PhD experience, but also like entire kind of learning process during in the higher education institution. I think this how they perceive that how much they are well kind of well evaluated or well served by university or government or social society. That is quite important. So I think we can consider like this kind of financial issues also can relate to this student. We can expand the student experience during the university, not only for the PhD program, but also like whole entire kind of period during in the universities. So that's what I want to talk. And related to the first question, so it is not that we could not find some kind of difference between the international and domestic, but kind of Japanese social system is quite related to the employment system. So that is the value of PhD is quite related to the employment system. So usually kind of society in Japanese society, they prefer like an undergraduate level or master level rather than PhD, because PhD means that only for like only for some specific group who want to enter academia. So entering the industry is not the value that in current situation. So not only for the international domestic, but the value of a PhD in Japanese society is not that high. And this kind of trend is quite related to the employment system that the companies or kind of incorporate, they want to train their own kind of workers rather than train it in the university. So these kind of things can make some kind of devaluation of the PhD in Japanese society. So I want to add this kind of point.
Good. Thank you. You talked about these financial issues. I was just curious. You mentioned something about this woman student, married woman, limited opportunity to the scholarship. I don't know if I fully understood. Can you explain a bit more, like what you mean by like household and then scholarship opportunity?
Yeah. So female academics, if because that is not the individual kind of individual based. That means that if they have family, like a husband or partner who have a full-time worker and have a salary, then female academics, they, because of the house, she included in household, so she cannot apply kind of scholarship or the PhD because her husband have the salary. It's a quite similar like full-time workers. They cannot apply the scholarship, but that is not based on herself. That is not based on individual because she has a partner who have a full-time job. Then she cannot apply for the scholarship. So,
So it's not because of male or female. Like if wife works and then husband wants to do PhD, it's the same thing, right? It's but of course most cases women are the one who works and then have a job and salary in Japan. Okay.
yes.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much. Well, we have a last 5 minutes. If someone has a really final question, this is the last chance that you can ask any final questions. Anyone who wants to ask a final question? All right. If there is no question, we can finish a bit like 4 minutes early today.